Welcome to the fifth in our series on the European Union and its legal organization. I'm Richard Sassoon with my co-host Aaron de los Reyes, and we'd like to set down the rules of the engagement. This is not an academic presentation. While I am a lawyer by training, we will not be covering the legal institutions that I've been studying. So Aaron and I are both laity who really are interested in this subject. We will try to give it from a secular, non-biased perspective as best as we can do that from being non-Europeans who are opining on this development. As is typical, I usually say, let's be respectful. There's always going to be sensitive subject matter, especially when we talk about modern politics. Let's be respectful of everybody's opinions. But that said, we love interactivity. Please put questions, comments, clarifications in the comments. We do read the comments. We will respond in real time to those questions, comments, concerns, and clarifications. Another key piece is that we like to say that this is a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you have some expertise on this subject, that's great. If you don't, that's fine. We'll definitely be accommodating to that. But the 201 part is that even if you have expertise, Aaron has dug to layers that you're probably not familiar with. And so it'll be a learning experience for all of us. I like to say that there's a 2-hour hard stop. So anything we don't get to by 4:15 p.m. Eastern time, that will be the last slide we stop on, and we'll continue next time. And like all the other 4 entries into this series, this is episode 5. Like the other 4 entries into this series, this will be recorded, and you can watch the entire series and get more details on the stuff that we will sum up in the beginning of the presentation. So Aaron and I talked, and considering this is the final day of the French election, it started the 12th of April. It's concluding today. You have multiple days to fill in your ballot. It would be a timely thing to talk about the French election. So, Aaron, I hand it off to you.
The original estimates were that Macron would have around a 56-44, and it looks like right now it's 57, 58, 42, which, compared to 5 years ago is about a 6% increase for Le Pen. But, you could say that's a pretty resounding defeat, better part of 15%. I think one of the things that will be key to going forward and paying attention to what's going on in France is the legislative elections coming up in June, which I don't think there's quite a bit of coverage in. And so it'll be interesting to see if, or see how the left and the right in France in essence, try to organize for that. And if Macron can build a set of coalition partners so that it isn't just about winning a presidential election, but actually and naming a prime minister, but actually having, the, let's say, legitimacy and legislative authority to be able to enact the very pretty large and expanding program that Macron has, or that he seeks to develop in France going forward the next 5 years.
Interesting. So how do you think the legislative elections are going to pan out given, let's say, Macron's victory at 58% as the current polls show?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that if you're at 57, 58%, that he was able to pick off enough Gaulists, what used to be Republicans, which, both of which are getting less than 5% of the vote. And what you would define as sort of traditional, left of center socialist. And so the question is, do they fall back into their sort of camps and basically splinter their votes, or do they coalesce? And I think that's going to be really the test coming up, because if Le Pen can keep, this sort of, let's call it surging populist right sort of framed together, that's going to be potentially sort of a legislative earthquake inside France. Because the real question becomes, as you move out to more regional, provincial, local elections, is that the funding mechanisms, which are defined by law, really kind of kick into play. And at that point, you would be looking at really a surging party across all of France, which could be in some ways actually more potent than even Le Pen winning.
I actually want to drill down on something that you said that may be a little surprising to our American audiences. Um, One of the things is that election funding in France is given based on the percentage of seats that that party occupies in the various tiers of government. It's not through private fundraising or equal between the different parties. So a legislative success by Le Pen's party, even increasing to 15 or 20% of the Assemblée Nationale, of the National Assembly, could lead to a lot more funding for right-wing candidates in the future and
That's
propel
exactly right.
future presidential elections.
Yeah, and you could make an argument that there was and I'm not doing this normatively or morally, it just sort of was de jure, that there was really basically a collective ban on funding through any means, through French private citizens, banks, anything, of the right for probably 15 years. But there becomes this reality that once you start crossing that 5%, 10%, I mean, it just becomes built into to their law, and you can't stop that, right? I mean, if you did, that would probably be civil war, actually. But so I think this is going to force at some point is the left and the center left is going to have to figure out eventually how to reconstruct a working functional coalition that isn't built on sort of personalities. And that's, as we all know in the West, that's harder. That's, easier said than done. And I think that's going to be really the test is, can they do that?
Absolutely.
If they can't do that, then they're likely going to see this constant fragmentation, and in a strange way, the left will become the spoiler party, which they're, that hasn't been the position they've consistently been in for 30 to 50 years.
Absolutely. Now, a question that, so I want to sort of explain what we're looking at in terms of the pictures, and then perhaps I have a question that to sort of ask about this. So we can see in the upper left-hand side, this was the first round of the French election. Now, France is electing according to a majority position, which is different than the United States, which is what is called the first past the post election system. So in the French system, if you do not get over 50% in the first round, there is a second round between the top two candidates. And you can see there, Macron and Le Pen were the top two candidates, so they were the ones that went on into the election that's taking place today. Now, you can also see that there's a third candidate, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's only 1.2 percentage points below Marine Le Pen, and he comes from the Socialist Party. So you can see there's still a very large groundswell of leftist support for Mélenchon in the first election. And if you look at the map on the right-hand side, you can see which districts voted for which leaders, right? You can see Macron. You can see Macron's area in yellow. You can see Marine Le Pen's area in blue. We just got an update that he won with 58.2%. Now, we can also see that in the south of France, we have a large amount of area that is pro-Mélenchon, and that's right next to area that's very pro-Marine Le Pen.
That's right.
So
I mean, you could almost argue there's like a Bernie Trump thing going on there in the sort of outer bands in France. And I think one of the challenges is, I mean, and nobody said this, is, I mean, a few people have, but nobody's really pushed this, is that Mélenchon really never built a coalition, because if he did, it's pretty clear he would have come in second, and probably safely. I mean, he probably would have had close to 30%. Maybe had a dominant position. I mean, he probably would have turned out in a very similar fashion. He probably would have had a.
Can you dig into that a little bit? What would this coalition building have looked like?
Well, I mean, this is where you get into the challenge of the history of leftist politics in France, where going back to really 68, right, where you really have to where you almost look at it as like a political religious test, like a purity test. There are true hard leftists still, there are true hard socialists, sort of in the Mitterrand, 1980s sort of definition, really almost statist, industrial socialists. And then you have sort of what you could call the modern progressive socialists, like you would see in most of the rest of the world and the West, which are much more of a development in the 90s and 2000s. And they all have, basically personalist parties. In many cases, these parties are sort of constructions of themselves. And they get funded. They have their nice headquarters. There's little documentaries made about them. I mean, they got their gig, basically. And I think they view their legitimacy as legislative, and that basically running for the presidency is sort of this, throwaway in some ways. If given the choice,
it gets the name out there.
Exactly, because and what you recognize is it really is, these are really our national, national centric parties that are not really focused on anything else but the national government, right? They're not trying to compete in Calais or in Burgundy or Chazan. I mean, they're not going out trying to get towns with 2,000 people to vote for them. They're not putting they're not recruiting candidates in that same way. Very much like you could say Democratic Party in the US or in a version of that in other countries aren't going out to whatever their West Virginia is and try to hunt votes. And so they have this upper limit always. And because they tend to be defined around urban areas or around industrial unionist areas, very, very defined population. That was really their original personalist construction, really, right? I mean, most of them came up on the left as part of a movement, right? They were movement people, whether it was a movement around rights, a movement around unionism, a movement around trade. I mean, they all had a movement-centric identity, and to sort of smish this together and call it now the Democratic French Party or something like that, that just there doesn't seem to be the actors there that have the gravitas and the maturity and the force of will, right? The sort of LBJ that could just ram these things in, and until that happens, I just don't see a unified left that could get 40+% of the national vote in a presidential election.
Interesting. We have two comments. One is that what really seems to have put Macron over the top is the war that started in Ukraine, and so the sort of solidification behind the current leadership, and that Hollande was the previous French president who was from the left, really destroyed their mandate with the way that he was acting. Do you want to comment on either of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think Le Pen lost the election because she's Le Pen and that party, and that they are sort of stuck in their revanchist views, and they haven't matured. They can't get to 50%. I mean, there would have to be such a radical set of events that actually happened to France, right? I don't think normal politics would push those other 8 to 10% above. So I think the comment is correct in terms of what pushed Macron from 50 to 58. I think that's probably true, but I think Macron started at 50, just waking up, just as a heartbeat. Basically, this would be. You could argue this would be a far more massive upset than sort of Trump Clinton in 2016, just because of the chasm that would have to have gotten crossed by several million French voters that have no historic interests with what Le Pen and the party represent.
Absolutely. No, one of the things I wanted to point out is if you look at the lower left, that is a graph that was a poll of if your first vote candidate was insert person on the left, would you be more likely to vote for Macron or for Le Pen? And you can see that with the exception of those who voted for Zemmour, then pretty much everybody would majority vote for Macron again in the general election, or significantly more than Le Pen. But we should probably move on to the discussion that we were originally
Yes.
going to have.
Thank you, other Richard. No, we wanted to cover, just so you know, we always want to try to cover something topical if it's substantive. And to be honest, this is substantive to this conversation today, which is obviously the French are a dominant, if not the dominant party in European security from an EU perspective. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to cover that for a few minutes, for 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So.
And the thing is that while Macron is very much in favor of further European Union integration, Le Pen is exactly the opposite. So that actually would have huge resounding effects on the future of defense formation in the European Union. All right. Now, just a quick summary of where we've been, right? We talked about the formation of the European Union that started with the coal and steel community in 52, and then the European economic communities in 1957, along with Euratom, and those three eventually being brought together. We have the economic integration that we talked about with the euro and the increasing centrality of that currency across Europe. We have the Treaty of Lisbon that finally tried to organize and create a coherent set of standards, even though it falls short of being a European constitution. We have all these different European organizations. We've talked about how that creates a number of instabilities in terms of maintaining the European Union because of the different entry and exits of those different organizations and where they fall in sort of this alignment. And in the Treaty of Lisbon, a number of different internal organizations within the EU were homogenized into the European Union itself. So when we got to EU governance, we talked about how the European system is a supra-state structure, right? It has more powers than an international organization, but fewer powers than an individual nation state. It has multi-level governance, trying to devolve as much power as possible to the European Union member states, except in areas of exclusive competency. And the legitimacy has always been precarious because of democracy issues. And we talked about the different branches of the European Union. It has legislative, executive, and judiciary branches. And we talked about how the laws were directly applicable. In contrast to other international entities, there is no requirement for the European Union member states to implement the laws passed by the European Union legislative and executive organizations. They are laws in the member states through act of the European Union. And we call this direct applicability. And except in cases where the nation state law takes primacy, which are those ones on the right-hand side here, the European Union law takes priority over those member state jurisdictions. And that's developed by the principles of proportionality and subsidiarity. If you want any clarity on what I just bulldozed through in the last 3 minutes, episodes 1 through 3 go much more in depth on all of these topics. And then we got to the Common Foreign Security and International Relations until 2015.
Great. So the thing we have to recognize is that as the EU was going through this massive evolution of building a supranational structure, they also were having to contend with developing a common foreign and security policy with all their various actors, while those various states still had their own, obviously, security and foreign policies, and also all of their interrelationships. So what we wanted to do is really give sort of a background phase of this until we bring it all the way up to speed in the 2020s and over the next several presentations, so that we understand how we get to where we are, which especially now with the new strategic compass that was just ratified or agreed to at least in the last few weeks, and there's the EU Defense Summit in May. So my goal is to be able to cover the strategic summit, the compass, and the outcomes of the defense summit over the next few months of presentations also. so that we could see how this sort of funnel or this common thread is being pulled together over the last 20 plus years. I always like to just remind people, because I think in our minds we always like to say things like the EU should do this, and what we really are saying is the country known as the EU should do this, and we have to recognize it's not a country. It has, or if it is, it's the most loosely coupled country in human history. So you have this incredible differentiated calibration of all of these policies across economic, social, industrial, legal, constitutional, security, and relations, and they always are evolving. Obviously, Ukraine is going to represent a new phase of that evolution, but we shouldn't get too far out in front of our skis and assume that by the time the EU has all of the, let's say, tooling in place to do the evolution, which might be a year or 2 or 3, that events won't have either tempered down or the actors so changed that the change is more marginal than people would have expected, because the history tends to be that way. When there's a massive event, whether it's COVID or whether it was the migration crisis or the Euro crisis, et cetera, which are 3 of the biggest ones, with now Ukraine, you look 2, 3, 4 years after, you don't see a radical redevelopment of all of that policy around it. I mean, you see all the triage and band-aids and sort of outcomes, but you don't see that new, sort of sarcophagus of policy. And if I'm a betting person, I think Ukraine might have more of that, but it's not going to look like a nation state level, national security policy coming out of Ukraine. It just
Interesting.
Yeah.
Aaron,
Go
we
ahead,
have a
please.
question in the comments. This graph cuts off in 2010.
Yep.
So are the legal injustice categories still being mostly held at the EU level today, especially
Well,
given the Visegrad movement in Poland and Hungary?
Yeah, I mean, as we get into further presentations, I have a version of this that takes us from, let's say, the Lisbon Agreement. Realize a lot of our presentations, at least for the infrastructure phase, ties us to the Lisbon Agreement, right? Because that's when the place sort of gets more nation statey. That would be sort of my definition, because all the constitutional processes failed. So they had to sort of ram it all into the treaty, and then everybody said sign before anyone, can chase us out. And then you could say there's EU after Lisbon, and that's how I define it. I think there's sort of 2 EUs: the EUs before and the EU after. So the question around justice, constitutional policy, is that because of the failure in the constitutional, the complete attempt to build really an EU constitutional framework, that's truly a third rail kryptonite, right? People are not attempting to use, or the EU itself and parties are not attempting to use the normal constitutional frame to sort of drive everything through. Richard talked about this in the past with directives. I mean, directives have become basically the soft laws and bills that are basically, let's say, highly encouraged with penalties, right? So it's a coercive. It's really, if we're being honest, it's coercive legal doctrine is what it is. Very sort of 17th, 18th century, actually, in some ways, which was obviously created in Europe, in general, anyways. But so when it comes to things like work conditions, you're seeing more of an EU policy shift there. And to be honest, COVID was a sort of a catalyst in some ways. It was already going in that momentum, but COVID, I think, is going to maybe push that all the way through with new law, and especially all the new digital laws, data privacy, work rules, hours worked, et cetera. So I'll see things like work conditions changing. Health, as we saw through COVID, if for those of you that are European, the EU policy there was, we'll hold PowerPoint meetings and please do more at the national level. I mean, that was basically the policy. They tried some type of common purchasing model, et cetera, but they just don't have the mandate there. So then when you look at things like citizenship, this is where I think the EU is really attempting now the next 10, 15 years to make a bigger push. And this sort of fuses together with immigration and migration. And I do think if there is a big one out of Ukraine here, it will be that. Because if you look at what wasn't achieved after the last, after the massive challenge of migration coming out of Syria and Iraq and Libya and the Middle East in the 2010s, early mid 2010s, Ukraine is so close, has such volumes that they're having to address this, and I think that will be one of the benefits of this when it comes to sort of citizenship participation. I think we've talked before, that's just hard. I mean, they do not have a devolved mechanism in the EU, right? You don't have your local council EU member in your town that you can go talk to and complain about, how come the funding that was approved for us hasn't been translated to my local train stop? Like, you can't do that. It doesn't exist there. So until they want to do that because they recognize that's a legitimacy problem, I just don't think the participation cycle is going to change at all. And I think that's generational, to be honest. I think that'll be technology, new generations. So maybe 10, 20 years, that'll change. So I'll fly through like Richard did, with those, first sort of 10, 15 slides I covered last time. But so the concept of the European defense community in the early 50s, was really, and we have to put ourselves in their shoes coming out of not just World War II, but World War I also, right? I mean, so there was World War I and then there was World War II, is that obviously West Europeans, they viewed their world as, we're stuck with the Americans to provide, basically security. We don't want to rearm Germany, period. And we have this Soviet Russian bear thing. And so, not a great hand, let's put it that way, if you're playing poker, but, and obviously France, given its history, with Germany and just its history period, it became fundamental that, in essence, France had a direct veto on the, let's say, the ability for Germany to become at all a security state, basically. And, what you could say is there was a group of forward thinkers that attempted to not be that way, to sort of see the world as where it was going or where it could go. And they were the cutting edge thinkers attempting to put together sort of a new collective security. I mean, they were just 60, 70 years too early, to be honest. But it's the same thinking and same framework, but the reality is that the French just wanted nothing to do with that. And it's one of the reasons the French developed their own nuclear weapons and on and on and on. So anyways, but that's sort of the early background post-war. And then we have the WEU, which is given, the failure of the ability to develop a European defense community. This really became about, how do we almost use Germany as a forward presence vessel for European security? And how can France keep its, continental position as really defense in depth from a Russian threat? Because I think it became clearer as you move into the later 50s that West Germany was not going to be a threat to France in its construction, given the presence of the United States there, and given how the evolution of what NATO was becoming. So so when West Germany became a NATO member in '55, which to do that required the French to agree, right? I think we always forget that part, is that France's position on both the Security Council and within NATO then, until they were out of NATO, and then came back in, that gave them this lens into defining how really everything would be defended in all of Western Europe. And so the WEU really didn't exist except for the fact that it was just Western European states. So it really duplicated a lot of what NATO did. It was really almost a mechanism for Western Europeans to talk about security and to sort of air their grievances and to, achieve some type of political unity. Because the U.S., to be blunt, just didn't want to manage these things, right? I mean, the history of the United States often is just not wanting to get involved into the minutia of European state politics, basically. So the Fauché Plan. So I think one thing to recognize is that that the Gaullists, and obviously President de Gaulle, always viewed Europe as a collection of nation states, and that there wasn't this sort of supranational sense of what Europeans were, or that they could be governed or should be governed, but that there would be a national character always first and foremost. And of course, the Fauché Plan excluded Britain, and that's one thing to recognize as part of this Brexit cycle. Not to say that that's the reason people voted for Brexit. It just shows that there was always this highly exclusionary nature. Or, yes, I guess we're supposed to invite Britain to the wedding, because, Britain's the brother-in-law or whatever, right? There's always been this sort of dimension there. And the French have had a very strong veto position on this. And one of the key components of this in the Fauché Plan was to basically exclude Britain. And the Benelux countries, which never have felt secured under a Franco-German axis, let's just be very honest. But the French and the Germans never really cared about that for obvious reasons, basically vetoed this. So, in essence, this whole process was never going to become, developed because you just had so many national states with their own interests, and they could never collectively agree, except the fact that they were under the NATO, i.e. under the US, security umbrella for Europe. Next slide real quick. Thanks. So, a couple things, as each generation of leaders came in, I think this is one thing to sort of recognize. Every generation takes a swing at this, every 10 years to 15 years of political leaders, right? They always take a swipe at, can we somehow pull our collective security together differently? And obviously they're responding to the threats and the events that are happening out in the real world over the generations. So one of these was the development of the EPC as part of the Hague Summit in '69 to drive further integration. And then there was a set of reports, the Copenhagen one actually being, I'd say pretty substantial because it constructed the meeting of basically the big heads, right, the foreign ministers, and then created a space for the defense and security cooperation conversations and international relations. And so that was the big deal. And that started this sort of intergovernmental communication, which, to be honest, you see pretty good communications has never been the issue. I mean, I think, if you look back in the 40s, the 50s and 60s it was, but in the modern world, I think the flexibility that you see defense and foreign ministers and international security people, almost cohabitating together is almost never been an issue. It's not the working relationship issue, which is really solved by this whole EPC process. So the one thing to go back real quick is that the security and defense pieces, which were NATO driven, were left out of the EPC. Because everybody knew this thing was just was kryptonite, and the French basically said, we're not going to have that conversation. So next generation, we get another rejuvenation under Rome, and Rome was a big deal in terms of the whole Rome Declaration and the construction of the EU itself. And so, what a new generation figured out is how to attempt to build a European defense identity within the NATO framework. So recognizing that becomes harder to resist, and also the fact that, and this is one little small thing that most people don't realize, is even though France came in and out of NATO and back in, it took until basically around 2009, 2010 for them to join the integrated command again. So they didn't join the integrated command until a little over a decade ago. And there's debates right now on how far have they joined that, because I think you could make an argument, a fair one, that if you saw a NATO meeting that had a US, NATO Supreme Allied Commander, 4-star, and you saw a French 4-star right next to them as a deputy commander, I think that sends a different signal. And that's not what you see right now. And I don't think you're going to see that for a while. Probably we're talking another generation cycle on this. What's going to happen eventually is there will be a French set of a French generation of officer culture that says, why aren't we doing this? And then they're going to put the pressure on the political system. And then that would be that necessary change, because they're going to recognize that France by itself misses out on the benefits that you get when fully integrated. And right now they don't miss those benefits at this point. So one other piece to this is that this sort of the WEU tracked a funky version of expansion within the EU expansion, and then also within the NATO expansion, right, until it sort of ceased to exist. So Spain and Portugal, joined in 1990, which was a big deal because they also were party to the Gulf War and part of the large UN coalition. So that I think we talked in the past about how much the Spanish and the Portuguese have sort of evolved as a fairly forward-footed, especially the Spanish, NATO partner, and defense and security industrial complex, and I would say national security state. I mean, it's sort of one of those underneath the radar to start looking at what they produce and how effective they are. Now, this goes back all the way to the beginning of the Cold War, which is the Europeans having to be under the U.S. American security blanket. And they wanted an independent security architecture, which allowed them the freedom of movement that could integrate into all of their other European priorities. Great objective, but and you could say, I'm sure by the 22nd century will happen. But when you look at all of the mechanisms in security, whether it's the different stages of deterrence, all the different domains of security and defense, all of the requirements in the modern world around expeditionary forces and all the logistics that are needed, I mean, it's really almost just an aim in terms of PowerPoint. It's not really or an aim in terms of a political aspiration in terms of ground truth, in terms of what could actually happen.
Was there a
Please.
distinct change in defense spending as a percentage of GDP after 1990 and the fall of the Soviet Union?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, great question. And you almost want to look at defense spending as sort of two buckets. So during the Cold War, there were things spent on supporting defense indirectly. It could be in terms of infrastructure. It could be in terms of transportation. And these weren't minimal, right? This was locations of airports. This was setting up depots, garrison areas. I mean, these were, there were several thousand of these, right? So, and they were, think of them as almost like webbed or like a network or a matrices. And a lot of that wasn't counted in sort of what you would traditionally think of as sort of direct kinetic defense and security. After the Cold War, it was. So you can make an argument that the pre-Cold War, the during Cold War and post-Cold War spending collapse was actually astronomical in these countries, except for places like Spain, because there's always a proviso on this. If a country has a very strong exporting defense industry, except for Germany, right? Germany is the weird exception here, where the Germans make some of the best defensive products in the world, but they don't buy them themselves, basically. And supposedly that's going to change with their $100 billion sort of infusion. We'll see. And we'll get to, when we get to Germany, because we'll break out each country at a certain point in the presentations going forward. But so you could say that the defense budget in the Cold War for most countries that were active participants in it and that viewed it as a direct threat was substantially higher. And a lot of it came down to the NATO requirements around training, around manpower, around the standardization in kit equipment. It sort of baked in a minimum spend requirement, which wasn't accidental, right? This was Eisenhower's plan from the beginning. He basically was constructing a Normandy-like expeditionary force just inside Western Europe. I mean, that was really, in some ways, his objective, which, after 75 years in the history of the world, there are not a lot of those that sort of still look like they make sense. And in this case, it did. But after the end of the Cold War, the concept of peace dividend everywhere became, core politics, and especially in Europe. And as the US pulled out, as there was a substantial decommissioning of, 80% of the defense infrastructure. And really, to be honest, the only thing that kept what was there was the war in Yugoslavia. I mean, you can make an argument that if the war in Yugoslavia didn't happen, Europe would have pretty closely disarmed. It would be a shell of what it even is now. You'd only have defense in those states that even produce things. So I think, sadly, but I think given what happened in Yugoslavia and its deconstruction and the externalities and the effects of that, forced, because of NATO, because of UN missions, and also just regional collective security, forced a stabilization of those defense budgets, or which you could say is somewhere around 1.5%, maybe 1.25% to 1.5% of actual defense goods and product, which would be training, operations, actual defense, security driven, manpower, person power, and products, which is not very high. Right. I mean, if you're spending that much money, you're talking objectively at probably less than 1 in 10,000 people as a ratio of your population that actually could be a kinetic combatant, which is extremely small.
You have here the Gulf War, and
yep.
I sort of wanted to draw a comparison. Did the Gulf War create the same need for European defense as the Yugoslav conflict?
Yeah, no, it didn't. And in some ways, what the Europeans have been smart, or let's say short-term smart about, is graphing on the U.S. security umbrella. So, obviously, the Europeans participated pretty substantially in the Gulf War. I think it was 7 states. I think it's 7 or 9 states participated. I think it was 9. And obviously, one thing most people don't remember is the new Russian Federation, last Russian Federation end of the Soviet Union. They were in that squishy zone. They basically approved of the Gulf War, or let's put it this way, they didn't disapprove of it. And which is extremely unique in the last 75 years in the world. So the Gulf War allowed the Europeans to leverage, obviously, the US's total commitment, and then the logistics capacity, right? Because if the European forces had to get to, Saudi Arabia by themselves, I mean, they could have gotten there over probably 6 to 12 months, but they wouldn't have been able to get there in 60 to 90 days. And so that obviously exposed the complete lack of lift, what's called strategic lift and carry, which basically Europe didn't have, doesn't have, and to be honest, doesn't address that they don't have. And in the modern world, you can't be expeditionary without that. I mean, you just can't be. You're buying parade troops basically at that point, because you can't get them anywhere. So I think instead of, to be honest, it was sort of a dumb miss, because there's a huge economic benefit to building lift capacity, because it's some of the highest dual use you're ever going to get in any industry, for obvious reasons, because of the global expansion of trade the last 30 years. If the Europeans had become, let's say, a lift superpower, which they absolutely could have, they would have kind of killed two birds with one stone. They would have benefited from all of the benefits in selling. It's really almost 3, because then Europe would have increased their likely trade also, because why wouldn't you want to trade more with somebody that is the lowest friction in transportation, right? So that's a miss that they're paying for, forever, right? Until they decide to stop paying for that.
Now, one thing that's interesting to me is if we look at the slide, right? You had Britain supporting the US in terms of the invasion, and Spain as well with strong military action. You had France trying to look for a diplomatic solution, Germany having the constitutional issue with sending military forces out, Ireland concerned with neutrality. How does this defense Hydra situation get resolved, or does it?
Yeah, I mean, look, the U.S. was very fortunate generationally to have someone like Jim Baker, which, if you look at the history of any country, you might get 1 or 2 of those people every 50 or 100 years. And so, history was fortunate in that Jim Baker landed right at that moment. So, he could Jim Baker it, with all of the legislative Jedi skills that he had for decades, that he used in all his other roles as chief of staff and treasury secretary and advisor and this and that. So he was able to, let's say, horse trade all of the necessary piece parts from each of the states that they could provide. And so if that meant the Germans were going to provide medical infrastructure as part of the Gulf War, then they, so that they would have created a forward presence tier 1 triage units. Then they did that, right? And so there was a way to generate a, let's say, working coalition, which is really what happened. And so I think. But the problem is that you can't plan in life in anything on getting a Jim Baker to solve all your problems. And as we all know, if we probably none of us have ever had a person like that who can fix everything that goes sideways with anything in your life, you probably don't get one of those. And the way history works is, right now, a Jim Baker would probably help out a lot, but you don't have one to work with. And so I think the Gulf War exposed these concrete limitations of where the Germans were not willing to go. And let's be honest, the Germans were dealing with another Jim Baker fix, which was the integration of West and East Germany, right? And so, this was all happening or teed up really in parallel. So it was actually kind of amazing that the Germans could even field medical support units, inside. And the deals were, the Germans would be on the southern tip of, Sardinia, or, the closest spots in Turkey, Italy, et cetera, so they could provide support because they're, in theory, it's in NATO. So that's how you would deal with those type of sort of unique coalition constructions. But I think, as we know, there's very few people in the world that actually have that skill set, that don't look at every opportunity or everything going wrong as a negative, but look at it as an opportunity and figure out how to put 2 and 2 and get 10
jigsaw pieces together.
Exactly.
Now, I have a comment. I'm curious what your reaction to it is. The EU participation in the Gulf Wars and in Afghanistan is really more for show politically than for a real hard, substantial military commitment. The Gulf and Afghanistan, I disagree with, and we'll get into Afghanistan a little later. The Gulf, primarily because you have to recognize what was going on, very similar to the energy threat that Europe right now feels, given the situation in Ukraine right now, the war in Ukraine, is the fact that, in essence, the hijacking of, the enormous percentage of the hydrocarbon architecture by a, sort of a rogue leader-ish rogue state, and jeopardizing, in essence, the world economy. And the thing that we just can't forget is that there was already a recession in 1990 as we were going in to the invasion. So the economy had, not just the United States, but in Europe, the economies were on a natural business cycle. And so this was, so it's somewhat similar to where we are now, and not quite, but a similar feeling, let's say. And so there was I think, a concrete sense that number one mission is you have to get the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, and more importantly, and this was really a red line, is prevent them from taking Saudi Arabia. So I think that commitment, especially around Saudi Arabia, was pretty legitimate. And I think if that had been tested, you would have seen a substantial escalation and response by European states because of the implications of energy in a recession. I mean, it's not rocket science to see that's how you can get to a depression, basically, or at least a extremely deep recession. It doesn't have an out, right? You can't print more money and get out of $200 oil, right? That doesn't really help you, right? You need oil prices to get stabilized to a point that industrial producers can make products that are profitable enough to still make, and people can drive vehicles or use transportation. And then the last piece on Afghanistan, given the the scale of the attacks on 9/11 in the United States and the amount of European citizens that died, that were killed, and then eventually the follow-on attacks, which really were in Europe, if we're going to be honest about it, for better part of the following 15 years. I think the European commitment to the missions in Afghanistan was pretty substantial. And you see it in, now you could make a fair argument that they go from more contribution show
to being extremely activated once one of the states in Europe is hit with a substantial attack, whether it was Spain, whether it was France multiple times, whether it was England, the Netherlands, even Germany. I mean, so, yep, go ahead.
A quick question on your red line in Saudi Arabia. Was there a legitimate fear that Saddam Hussein was going to either invade Saudi Arabia or try to annex its territories or otherwise?
I mean, it's not an accident that, the first forces the United States put there, were basically in essence, Cold War rapid reaction airborne forces, right? Which at the time was the 82nd Airborne's 325, 173rd Airborne out of Vincenza. I mean, it was I think any rational view of it during that period, and I was a participant during that period, was that the scale of forces that the Iraqis placed in southern Iraq in Kuwait were so much greater than you needed for taking Kuwait. It didn't square up with, you don't put 20 plus armored and mechanized divisions to take Kuwait. And we know this because they didn't use that many to take Kuwait. So, and I think the only way you could have done an A/B test is no one responds and see what would have happened. Would the Iraqis have partially invaded? Would they have taken various oil fields? I mean, what would they have done, right? I mean, I don't think the answer was they were going to do nothing. So I think in the end, Saudi Arabia was the red line. I mean, it just was. There was no way around that. And I think that was what made what Hussein did such a substantial miscalculation, because, he didn't, and they didn't recognize how every country, from whether it's Japan that was so dependent, so Japan went into which was already in a bad recession starting in 89. So, think about it. They had their own bad recession in 89, huge stock market crash down 30, 40%. And then you had the natural repercussions of Europe and the US that were going through the end of their business cycles pre-invasion. And then kaboom, the invasion hits. I mean, in some ways, Japan was sort of like the 08, 09 financial crash at that point. So you had, huge global actors that were being impacted by this. And I don't think we can even model what would have happened if Iraq had taken Saudi Arabia and, distorted the oil market. I mean, basically OPEC would arguably, I'm not saying it would shut down, but it would be so distorted at that point that I don't know how you could create OPEC targets. I mean, just the whole system would have gone haywire, basically.
Absolutely. We had a follow-up question to that, which I can sort of address. But Saddam's forces proved highly ineffective. Surely we had intelligence on him that comes from prior to our direct confrontation with him. And I would say, yes, Saddam Hussein would not have been able to invade Saudi Arabia if he was fighting Western forces. What Saudi Arabia has demonstrated quite clearly, and I think you brought this up last time we spoke, is that putting millions of dollars on military hardware does not buy military excellence. And Saudi Arabia, despite having some of the most advanced weapon systems in the world, doesn't have the effective manpower that can use them effectively. And we forget that the Republican Guard that Iraq had during the Persian Gulf period was actually one of the largest militaries in the world.
And don't underestimate, they spent the better part of 10 years fighting a, let's say World War I with post-Vietnam era technology type fight, with Iran-Iraq, the Iran-Iraq war. And so this was not a force that, you can, in a revisionist way, go back right? I mean, I don't think most people don't want to bet their national security on the belief that, a bad actor is a yo-yo every time. Because, if you kind of take the Talib, anti-fragile model, you probably want to hedge yourself against the bad actor is a yo-yo every time, because I think that's a very dangerous proposition. And especially, and I think this is the key, is when something has a systemic, sort of implications, right? Whether it's finance, whether it's energy, whether it's transport, there's a handful of aspects of modern life that are so systemic that if actors distort them, private or public or international, whatever, they basically flatten an enormous way that a huge amount of the population lives. And I just don't think the response to that is just like, oh well, hopefully he sucks, right? Like, I just don't think that's a strategy, basically. So this is a fundamental. This divide goes back. You could almost say this is Old Testament European international politics, right? Going back to the World War II, really. In some ways, even back to World War One. But there's a big population in the European security universe, and I think especially with what's going on in Ukraine, I'd say the Atlanticists have. At least at this point, they're ahead in the Tour de France, no pun intended. And what the Atlanticists are about is really, it's the U.S. deterrence and security umbrella. Think of it as like, providing the expeditionary, fighting force. And it's the European commitment to supporting that, kind of adhering to it, standardizing around it, and then building its own organic capacity as it can politically. That's the sort of Atlanticist view. It's NATO. NATO is, it's one of the, it's within the prayer book, let's say. And whereas a Europeanist view, which is obviously a very strong French view and was extremely strong in the past, is basically, this is European business. We don't want to have we don't want to be tied in Europe to the ups and downs of American policymaking, elections, approaches to security, and to be honest, I think one big aspect of this too now has become, as the U.S. has become, I'd say more kinetically engaged in the world the last 20 years, from the war on terror to, these sort of hotspot events. I think there's a big chunk of the Europeanist view that say that that's a policy space that's out of bounds for us. Like we just don't agree with it. We don't agree with it politically, socially, morally, whatever. And then as a byproduct of that, the U.S. is evolving its sort of combined expeditionary multi-domain capability. That's a bunch of complicated language to say basically advanced military capacity, in a way that the Europeans are going to have to spend a huge amount of money to become as relevant. And you're seeing that now in Ukraine, right, basically. And so the Europeanists basically say, we want to build a European defense, not deterrence, but defense, or deterrence through conventional defense. And they don't want to, and then there's not really an answer around nuclear deterrence or what's called strategic deterrence. Except for the French, who have it, and obviously the UK does, but the UK is not European in the EU sense, so it's really just the French that has strategic deterrence, and that's a whole nother kind of conversation, where the French have never been willing, and I argue never will, in reshaping their strategic deterrence for the benefit of any other state. Period. I just don't think that's a red line for them. They're not gonna share their strategic nuclear capacity with Germany and the Benelux. Like you're not gonna see that. So This is an important thing to pay attention to, because I think what's the reason this is important is that when you watch people on TV talk, and you maybe go and do a search on Twitter for who they are, or Google search on who they are, you want to figure out like, what camp are they in? Because that guides a lot of this stuff. Because they can have really good arguments, and they probably do, but if you don't know what camp they're in, you don't know really what's driving them. So anyway, that's the Atlanticist Europeanist. So, the Bosnian War, which I think, or the Yugoslavia falling apart, the European actors, let's just say, didn't shine. And I mean this in sort of objective terms, right? The Germans sort of, roguely went out and just sort of, basically said, we see Croatia and they're a state, and then that helped, ramp up and trigger additional conflict. So they were sort of all over the map, right? The French, the Germans, even the English, and all of the sort of international, all the foreign policy on cheap, which is to say, I recognize you, but that doesn't mean I'm going to actually engage you, in a risky proposition. I'm not going to put my citizens at risk. Is basically what the European states did. And then that mess, which turned into the Bosnian War, or at least started as the Bosnian War, could only get slowed down as you saw more NATO presence, which ultimately meant, more US presence, and obviously the UK and the French and others sort of, lined up. But once the threat to, the Bosnian Serbs was so substantial, and it was legitimate, I mean, i.e. they were fired on, then obviously they had to drive themselves to the negotiating table, and you started to see a shift there. But then the problem is that conflict just kind of kept evolving that way, whether it went to Kosovo, whether it went, and so really the NATO acted like the detention hall teacher, and all of the European states were in some ways reacting to the horror of what they saw. So you had, pretty good refugee policies. There was definitely good aid. You saw, good NGOs. I mean, there was a bunch of what you would call betterment activities. But when it came to, we're going to put French forces in between, non-combatant Kosovars to stop, basically Serbs from shooting them or hurting them, or the same between Croatians and Serbs, no one was going to do that. And so I think in the end, what made Yugoslavia so detrimental is there was never a report in the Copenhagen report. There was never that type of honest audit of the scale of actions. And I think, to be honest, you're seeing that sort of in Ukraine play out again. Not as bad. It's not as it has more cohesion now ish. It has more unified action ish. I think there's a different generation of adults at the table who are recognizing, people aren't as stupid as they used to be when it came to actions. It's good to do a do-good action, but if you're not changing what's happening, all you're going to ever do is respond with do-good actions, and which is very much what happened in the 90s in Yugoslavia. Obviously, it was 300,000 that lost their lives. And in the end, to be blunt, who's going to pay for this massive modernization reconstruction of former Yugoslavia as it enters into the EU? It's going to be the EU. It's going to be Europeans, right? Europeans are going to have to spend the hundreds of billions, directly or indirectly, but with those former states to bring them up to 21st century infrastructure, much of which was demolished in their wars. So
Now there's a quick
Yep.
question from the
Mhm.
comments actually on the Europeanist Atlanticist divide. Where would
Yep.
you place Turkey on that sort of argument? What sort of perspective do they have on this?
They're called Turkey. But no, I mean, they are their own animal, because we can't forget they have, the largest land force, in Europe. It is it is well tested in asymmetrical conflicts, since they've had one inside their own country for 60 years, and then in the region, the greater region, whether it's in Syria, indirectly Lebanon, and participating in sort of NATO activities over the decades, whether it was the first Gulf War, or whether it was various stages of the second Gulf conflict and reconstruction. So, and they have arguably one of the, I'd say, two or three most capable air forces. They actually have a very strong local regional navy. I mean, so they have, they're sort of a different kind of France without nuclear weapons, is sort of what they are. They bypass Europe pretty directly. They negotiate When they negotiate with the EU when it comes to security, it's only for let's say, kinetic activities, right? Migrants, economic aid, etc. If they have to deal with Europeans, they go directly to the power states, whether it's France, whether it's the UK. I know we don't call them European because they're not in the EU anymore, but they're in the this Western Eurasian place we call Europe. And they deal with the Italians because Italians have a good navy, so they, especially regionally. And all their funky stuff with the Greeks, which we don't want to go down that rat hole. But so I think Turkey tends to view security in sort of a realpolitik way, which is the U.S. is the dominant party in NATO. If you look at the bases they have that are NATO bases, they're U.S. run bases in Turkey. They have a pretty tightly integrated part of the Southern European part of the NATO command as a solid historical multi-generational group of Turkish officers and command, and basically a command posture, which has been leveraged. I mean, it's real. It's because of all the stuff that's gone on in the MENA region for decades. So, I view Turkey as almost a more active France, minus nuclear weapons. This is what makes Turkey a problem for the EU, because they are not an ascension state. They kind of were. Europe didn't build a multi-track system, which is my largest argument forever. That will be more meaningless than many others I've had, which would have probably kept the UK and Turkey and others in, and given a space for places like Poland and Hungary or whatever. If you could be a tier 2 European country, not a tier 1, whatever, the country wouldn't care. They get the benefits that make sense at that level, and that would be it. But you could get the systemically valuable things with that party. And so I think Turkey outside of the EU is just this reality that it's almost like a weird conjoined child created from the French and the US at this point for the baseline Europeans. They try to ignore the Turkey until they need their help, which is usually too late, and or when the Turks come calling and saying you have to do something or else I'm going to do something, and then usually the French show up or the EU commissioner and etc. So that's Turkey. I mean, it's a fundamental problem in EU security, because you have a tier 1 actor that I think would be reasonably compliant figure out how to play ball with them, and get out of the sort of personality phase of and I think that's the biggest problem you have in European defense politics, is it's so tied to personalization, and to be really fair, that is not the case with the professional officer classes in all of these NATO countries. So it really kind of does a disservice to them. I mean, you could say the political generation has done that, to be honest, and this is across most of Europe, really, for that matter. So in you had the Petersberg Declaration in '92 that defined the WEU and created all these tasks that made, in essence, this segregation between what we would generally term as humanitarian and peacekeeping and rescue missions, and separate that from NATO's mission. And to be really fair about this, I always love this because it provided that. I always think politics, to be effective, has to provide multi-track approaches, because everybody isn't at the same place, same time, and you create unhealthy Boolean or binary kind of outcomes, and then you live with the effects decades later, and the costs are just infinitely higher than creating a two-track approach. So this gave a bunch of states a place that they could participate and be very effective, and at the same time, NATO didn't have to take on these tasks, which NATO was never constructed for. And given that there is no NATO army, right? NATO is a management organization, basically. Think of it almost like a large holding company that pools those different business units and divisions, which would be those different states, military and forces that they nationally decide to allocate. Right, NATO doesn't tell them they have to allocate it. NATO sets a set of standards, a set of objectives, missions. Basically, think of it as like a training template around collective security, and then all the states sort of figure out how they can fill that in. And obviously, they do it enough times, and they get good at it, so they get the commitments behind it, and they build a sort of muscle strength to do it.
Now, there are two questions actually still related to Turkey. The first one is that we have both Turkey and Hungary buying a significant amount of weapons systems from Russia and from China. Mm-hmm. How does this complicate issues of EU security? And the second one is that Turkey and Germany had a long historic friendship, especially before World War I. How has the security situation played into that, complicated that, or otherwise changed that?
Yeah. So the second one first. I think because European security and defense has become personality driven, it's made it a nightmare, right? Because when you look at Erdogan and Turkey and sort of the, let's just say gaslighting that he did around the migrant crisis, and then you had sort of Merkel, acting as a, sort of a, which you could argue very German in the modern last 30 years, sort of as a rogue participant, just on a Wednesday announcing, boom, we're going to take 1.5 million or 2 million people out of left field, not coordinated with the rest of the EU or anybody else for that matter, much less the states they would have to go through to even get there. So, I mean, even that was sort of chaotic. You have this personality-driven dimension that has sort of overtaken that relationship, and I think until you get a generation of German and Turkish professionals at a very senior level that can kind of get a working model going again between them, which they had for a while actually, that existed during the Cold War. But all that muscle memory is gone until that gets recreated. You just can't be surprised when a German, van der Leyen will go down and bark at Erdogan, and then Erdogan will bark back up at Merkel, and it just like it turns into high school, ninth grade or ninth year, people acting that way, and it and then they use their tools, as sort of a personalist construction project. So I don't think there's a lot great that's there between the Germans and Turkey until you really have a generational change in their leadership that maybe comes out of the Ukraine crisis, maybe new generations in and then post Erdogan era in Turkey. Maybe that will level set things a little more. And then the earlier question around, the Turkey buying S-400s, S-300s, basically Russian tech. I want to kind of approach this as pre-Ukraine and then post-Ukraine. I think pre-Ukraine, this was a blend of sort of economically rational decision-making because of the costs and then gaslighting, right? And the fact that Erdogan could kind of stick it and say, oh, your rule is I can't use another air defense. Well, I'm using this other air defense. What are you going to do? And with the knowledge that obviously the Turkish Air Force, air defense, sort of air architecture is extremely US driven. So that's a lot of, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, et cetera, defense contractors that are producing, enormous amounts of maintenance, kit, sustainment, et cetera, that would put some pressure, or they thought that would put some pressure. That was a misread. It really was a misread. Look, I think objectively, especially with what happened in Ukraine, people are going to treat that as a mulligan, like a dumb one-off. I don't think going forward, Turkey is going to be running around trying to buy 30 S-400s. I don't think that makes a hell of a lot of sense for their own, like just thinking of their own security, like what their risks are and in the threat sort of matrix they're in. If you see Russia as one of the 2-3 major actors that could threaten Turkish security, as a peer actor, Russia, Iran, let's say those are the big two. You probably don't want to buy the air defense platforms that those peer threats make and leverage and use and know the cheat codes for. That probably doesn't make for great policy. So I think post-Ukraine, I think Turkey will kind of climb down off the roof, kind of jumping around, screaming naked, saying, I'm going to jump. And I think, they're going to go get their their necessary support and then come back and all's forgiven. And I, to be honest, I think these will be important lessons as the Turkey evolves past the Erdogan era. And I think there's a huge opportunity if all parties don't screw this up, which I give it a 50-50, to bring Turkey really into a closer EU, friendly context in general, and then at a security level. Because if we're going to be very honest, without Turkey, you don't have a defense in Europe in the MENA region. I mean, you just don't. The Italians and the Spanish and the French sort of, randomly doing it is not a policy, right? It doesn't work. You're not going to get the rest of the states in Central Northern Europe to come to the collective. This is ground truth, like to actually have the ships, the rotary wing, because that's what you need, right? When you're in that MENA region, it's a lot of rotary wing. It's a lot of, corvettes, Coast Guard ships. It's just a lot of that stuff. And you don't have that in the rest of Europe. And Turkey gives you the throughput there. And I think another aspect that they have that is extremely underrated is I would say arguably they are an intelligence superpower now in Europe. So they have a extremely potent I mean, some of it is their national security state because of Erdogan, but independent of that, they've built a very, very strong intelligence collection capacity and human intelligence, like the stuff that you can't buy by writing a check, right? So they have, a very strong human intelligence capability throughout the MENA region. I think probably as large as all the rest of the actors combined, to be honest. Just people aren't adults, right? They can't kind of square the benefits of Turkey with the gaps that Turkey has right now.
Right. So let's talk about Maastricht a little bit.
Yes. So Maastricht was an extremely important event. Probably the most, Rome, Maastricht, and Lisbon are the three sort of anchor modern events. And Maastricht basically created the legal environment that there could be a common foreign and security policy framework even developed, that it provided the guidelines for it. And there was enough unanimity. There was, I think, to be honest, the Gulf War helped. I think, the states in Europe recognized that they could not operate independently and have in the modern world and be able to confront a truly geostrategic, trans-regional type of security challenge, much less their backyard. And so the CFSP was really about a starting point. How do we create common security positions, or what are those common security positions, and how do we systemically cooperate on a daily basis and start building sort of that unanimity? And to be honest, decades of this has produced this ability that a deputy defense minister in the Netherlands can show up at a meeting in France and participate. I mean, they did this like this. No one, I'm sure they had some party to celebrate it 20 years later, but in the end, I mean, this is a win. This is a huge win, actually. And so it was about moving from sort of policy making to implementation and creating. And if you see the language today, you'll see things called joint actions, which is when states act together based on a council decision, which is used often in other aspects of EU policy. But the CFSP is where this came from, actually. So the language around joint actions came from here. And so these joint actions, and they'll say that a lot, joint action for this, joint action for that. These aren't throwaway words, right? These are literally part of the directive system that they've constructed. So that's you can high five your European friends on the CFSP at the next party you go to. I doubt they'll know anything about it, but and we talked about this. So this is where the intergovernmental pillars in the EU, where the Court of Justice had no jurisdiction over the CFSP, and the EC at that time, had no exclusive right to submit proposals to that work. So this was really about intergovernmental action between EC states. In some ways, they sort of jumped the transnational state phase pretty aggressively. But to be honest, I think it was so tied into Atlas obscurity, that people just didn't understand that's what was really going on there. It was that obscure. And then as part of the Petersberg Declaration, they created a mechanism for associate membership that offered non-EU members of NATO, including Turkey, Iceland, and Norway, to be associate members of the WEU. And they could participate in meetings as associate members, but they couldn't vote. They also created an observer status. So in a weird way, and this is like in the weed stuff. If you guys know what the OSCE is, and I don't want to go down that rat hole because that just gets you down a whole nother path in security gibberish. But basically, the WEU was like it was like a European version of the OSCE, really, in some ways. and that it created all these tiers of participation so that you could have a very common communications framework amongst all the intergovernmental parties within these states, which, to be honest, I think has always been a template to how to get things done in Europe. And instead of sort of two new prime ministers come together in nice blue suits, and sort of, announce things, and everyone looks at each other like, I've never heard of that. And then 6 months later, someone asks about it and no one knows anything, right? Versus this is where things are done. And the kind of things that are done here, which don't seem cool and hot and fun, but they're extremely important, are standardizing maritime communications, equipment, training, protocols, and also you see this in naval maritime operations. You will see ships, basically NATO ships is what they almost are, WEU ships over the generations, where you'll have a ship that's got 3, 4, 5 different member state participants because they're on a training mission and they're all just working together. To me, that is the template on how you get to a greater, collective security in the EU. So by 99, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland all became associate members. In 94, you had the Petersberg Declaration, which was sort of the final group of associate members. So, or associate partners, which was created, which were neither EU or NATO members, at that time, like the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia. So it's funny that the Russians have never sort of argued, because to be honest, like in the legal Richard, in Brussels way, this is actually a decent place that the Russians could have made an argument around sort of a gateway drug for NATO was really these memberships back in the 90s. But I actually don't think I'm not saying there's not someone in Russia that knows this happened. I just don't think anyone around them knows anything about this, to be honest. Because this sort of laid down a lot of the framework and infrastructure that allowed these states later to join NATO, basically, because they could get out of that Warsaw Pact. Because the Warsaw Pact was funky. A lot of people don't realize how it was constructed. It had a much heavier, almost colonial-like Russian presence on top of those states. And so when the Russians pulled back, those Warsaw states were sort of empty in terms of their military and defense, professionalism, and just developing their own independent state policy for obvious reasons, because the Russians didn't want them to have all that independence for, and an independent action. And so the WEU and then ultimately NATO really helped many of them construct for the first time in modern history their own, or the beginning of their own defense and security identity, basically.
I actually have a question from the audience. Was there any discussion in the WEU about surveillance? Did they create a counterpart to the NSA, for example?
Yeah, no, it's none of that. I mean, so one thing we have to realize about intelligence in Europe, and it's a great question because it actually never comes up. There's you almost want to think of intelligence as sort of 4 tracks now. The fourth one being created because of the post 9/11 world, where you're looking for really intense local terrorist or asymmetrical threats, which is almost like a fusion of sort of police, human intelligence, sort of strike team operations. Those are very unique, right? That's not traditional intelligence from a state power perspective. Then there is what you would almost call the intelligence sharing community, which is this very broad-based, almost intergovernmental sharing of databases, PowerPoints, presentations, summits, broad threats, common threat matrices, like this is problem X. We've been working on it together for 4 years. There's no magic. It's not a Jason Bourne movie. And then you have the military intelligences of each country, and they are unique to each country. They only work. They rarely work together. They work, across countries, but they work into NATO. So it's almost like, if you understand how in many cities in the world, how the transportation networks have been built for the last 100 years, everything terminates downtown, whatever that means, more often than not. So if you're trying to catch a subway from the Bronx to Brooklyn, good luck, not going through Manhattan. And in some ways, NATO was like Manhattan, or the center of Paris, or et cetera, right? And there are states that work together, but they're sort of like funky kissing cousins almost, right? So there'll be more sharing between the Netherlands and Denmark than there will be between the Netherlands and Germany. There'll be, because of all these, more modern, strange sort of events that have happened in the last 30, 40, 50 years. So that's another type of intelligence. And then lastly, and this is where you see it affect Ukraine and their policy response, is that there's no EU level security intelligence structure, and they don't want one. They don't want one. I mean, it allows them to have a passive denial, because I think probably rightfully they're petrified of a mistake or a bad action, or both, if they ever had that mechanism, and what the repercussions of that would be in terms of surveillance, within broad European citizens, et cetera. But it not modernizing the intelligence in Europe will mean it's like not having lift. It'll fundamentally be a gap between what their capability could be and what it really is, because you can't do something if you don't know what's going on. So, and if at the end of the day you have to rely on U.S. intelligence, I mean, when you get to that last mile or that last 100 feet, et cetera, if in the end you're relying on Turkish HUMINT, on French, UK, and US intelligence, and whatever rando stuff just tumbles in, that doesn't make much of a intelligence funnel for effective decision making. And that really is where you are. So, because we need more organizations. In 1994, at the NATO summit, there was the creation of the ESDI, European Security and Defense Identity, which was unanimous to all 16 member states, which it had to be unanimous. The main aim of the ESDI was to strengthen the European pillar, the WEU, and take more responsibility on security and defense affairs in Europe. So it was really about recognizing the post-Cold War and constructing a mechanism that Europeans could have a centrality in NATO, in its development and its sort of affairs going forward. And then the ESDI introduced all these task forces, of course, because you can't have a new European agency without fantastic task force job creation program. And so you had joint task forces that were developed for operations, where NATO doesn't take action, but where WEU uses its assets, especially humanitarian. Then the whole framework included borrowing assets from NATO, infrastructure, intelligence, logistics, communications. Communication is another issue too. It's just like intelligence. There's a very underperforming communications framework between the forces, except for maritime. Maritime and air forces are better. Air forces, because of deconfliction, right? You don't want planes running into each other. That has really almost more to do with civilian aviation more than anything else. But maritime is good. I mean, it's actually probably very good. Air Force is as good as it has to be for the civilian aviation to let them fly. Not much better than that. I mean, once again, there's special agreements because maybe the two countries will buy the same airframes from a contractor, so they share training and operations. So in that case, you'll have better relationships. But you don't see the Germans and French flying, together in a squadron on a regular basis, just bilaterally as a training mission for fun. That's just not something that regularly happens. Once again, the subway has to go through Manhattan. It tends to go through the NATO process, basically. Then the Treaty of Amsterdam. So obviously, when you create all these sort of agencies and new approaches, eventually they have to lead to a treaty because they come in conflict with each other. So the Treaty of Amsterdam, so this is where Richard's fantastic legal background helps because of the language, but it generated a new status of what was called constructive abstention, which was introduced, and it meant that a member state may abstain from an operation by remaining out while not vetoing others in it. And so this occurred obviously because of all of the repercussions of Yugoslavia, and then within CFSP there is a high representative position that was chosen under Article 26 to create. That was created in order to give a name and a face to the policymaking behind it, right? So this was their way of sort of having a, let's call it the fake European Commission defense minister, but not really. Sort of almost defense coordinator or security coordinator. Yep. So in the treaty, the entire Petersberg tasks were incorporated into all the new structures in the EU, and the Amsterdam Treaty basically harmonized all of the presidencies. Remember, we have all these presidencies in the EU and the WEU. Well, neutral states, and we can't forget Austria, Finland, Sweden, have always defined themselves as neutral states relative to common security. They were respected with exemptions. So this was a way to sort of square the circle of the gap of how to get participation, action, but not allow for vetoes to distort policy, basically. And, you had a deepening process of all of the security arrangements, but there was sort of a gap because you had in the Maastricht Treaty, foreign policy and defense were handled separately. So in the Amsterdam Treaty, stated the European Council shall define the principles, general guidelines for the common foreign and security policy, including for matters of defense, with defense implications. And this allowed sort of basically the development of what was the second pillar, which is going into Lisbon, important in the development of the Lisbon Treaty eventually. And then you can't have a new treaty without a new declaration. So you had in '98 the St. Malo Declaration. So Britain and France announced the need for a European army to deal with the Petersberg tasks. We understand Britain isn't in the EU anymore, but it doesn't matter because there's no European army anyways. But so this brings up something about that earlier Atlanticist Europeanism approach to security. There was always this belief going back really to the 50s and 60s within the non-national European movement, which was that Europe should have its own army. Whatever that would be. There's a whole bunch of practical reasons why that has never made any sense, given the lack of agreement of the states themselves in how they could participate in actions. So you could imagine a battalion of 600, and if they came from 15 countries and 12 committed to the action, but only 9 wanted to fund it and 7 wanted to expeditionarily involve in it, I don't know how that battalion functions, much less the language development, et cetera. I mean, it never made sense to have national forces that could be under NATO auspices and a European army. And that's still this sort of weird debate that people just can't, they can't get themselves out of. So, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on the UK pieces of this, but, basically, there's always been this France-UK collision on European security and power, obviously going back 1,000 years, to some degrees, but especially in the modern world in the last, 50 to 75 years. And the Brits always had this view, which, wasn't new, of not wanting to put, their resources under the auspices of, sort of common European institutions, and especially when it came to security. And obviously, especially if the French could get away with not doing it too, well, then, it's sort of like, 2 brothers or 2 sisters fighting over the PS2 station, right? I mean, it's, well, if you can't get it, I can't get it, let's break it. And so the UK basically was able to sort of unblock that veto they always had, and the French veto. And you started to get some movement, not on a European army, but on sort of common security cooperation. And to be honest, after 9/11, that accelerated pretty dramatically. I think one of the sad byproducts of Brexit, and also and Brexit on both sides, on the UK and the European side, is they never on the European side acknowledged how far the UK had come from where they were 50 plus years earlier, 60 years earlier, and then also where Europe was towards the UK, in, out, no, maybe, could come on Wednesdays for 2 hours. It was very, very happenstance until really the, let's say, late 90s. And once again, they couldn't construct that sort of multi-tier process. So the goal in the St. Malo Declaration was that the European Union would have its own autonomous security position, and it could take its own decisions politically and implement them militarily. That basically that would be a aspirational aim. And as we can see 25 years later, they can sort of do that. I think that would be sort of the fair grade at this point.
So we have a question in
Yep.
the comments. Under NATO agreement, was it ever possible to act first, either in preemptive or preventative measures countering likely incoming threats? And is there any legal language discussing this? My intuition, and perhaps I'm wrong in this, is that NATO provides the auspices for discussion in that type of scenario, that the members can certainly work as a military alliance to do it. But when we're talking about NATO working together in response to a military threat by force of the treaty, we're talking about the response to an attack against one member state.
Yeah,
so
that's exactly
preventative
right.
or preemptive strikes are those prior to such an event, and therefore have no binding effect on the other member states.
Yeah, exactly. And if we wanted to take if we wanted to scenario sort of a real world example. So let's say there was a non-high conventional threat from Russia, like little green men into, let's say, Estonia. Yeah, that would be kind of a good example. Not that that's never happened, but then, Estonia could respond. Estonia could leverage NATO, and NATO could declare a necessary response, which would be proportional. So if it was cyber, or if it was informational, or if it was, and then the question would be how kinetic would those actions be, right? That would be, but let's say the little green men sort of started to elevate beyond that to a more conventional prepositioning. At that point, NATO would be able to basically ask for resources and commitments from member states to deploy onto Estonia, basically in a defensive formation, in essence, to be simple, and then using intelligence and cyber and all the other dimensions and domains to act as sort of your sort of preemption. And where this would get really gray is if the goal was to conduct any kind of special operations. My view on that is those would stay extremely Estonian. Basically, they would be very contained to the proportionality of the state conflict. Now, where it would get in this scenario, where it would fall apart, is if that was happening across the Baltics. So you started to see that in Finland and Lithuania, Latvia, and it was coming from behind them in Kaliningrad and in front of them. Then I think, to be honest, all the sort of nice legal language starts to fall apart, and you basically have sort of a pre-Article 5 kicking in at that point. And because then sort of the dogs, fog, and guns of August kind of all kick in together on their own feedback loop. And I think when you decide to declare something at that point, almost becomes irrelevant, because the actions on the ground just become so, everything gets overtaken. I mean, look, that's one of the escalation dynamics that we potentially have in the next, months and year ahead of us, which I don't give a high probability, but it's there. It's no way it's not there. A two front attack from Kaliningrad and from the Northern Military District onto the Baltics, I think that changes things quite a bit for Russia and for Europe and for everybody else in between. Obviously, it would escalate everything dramatically. But I think at that point, you would see NATO states supporting the Baltics collectively with their own escalation, which you could argue is a form of preemption, basically, is escalation. Any other questions? Anybody? And then we're going to jump from here and then really take off into the into the 2000s and 2010s, and then we're also going to start breaking down the individual states, because I think it's pretty important, in to understand why and how they make decisions in security, defense, and foreign policy, because I think all we see is what the news gives us. Sometimes Reuters or others will give you a nice little couple paragraphs on, why, Austria is neutral, or why a decision is made in Switzerland, but they don't really give you that backgrounder, for a few extra minutes to kind of explain how they got there and how they could be evolving. And I think Ukraine is going to be this interesting test of generational evolution in a lot of the neutral states in Europe, actually. I think you're going to see a lot of states go from, I'd call it flat neutral, to like neutral plus. And then a few jumping off into not being neutral anymore. But I think most of them are going to become neutral plus, which really is a gateway to not being neutral anymore.
For those who are here, I have updated the meetup page. Our next meeting should be the 22nd of May. That works for you, right, Aaron?
Absolutely. Perfect.
So it's 22nd of May, 2 p.m. Eastern time. That's 7 p.m. British time. And you should be able to find it, as I said, on Meetup.
And also keeping with my always bringing something European-ish, whether it's a shirt color or in this case, the cup for Holland. Yes, exactly. Dutch tulip. There you go.
So do we have any final questions before we close this out and we come back in a month to slowly inch our way into the 20th century,
Well, remember,
21st century
I'm following your Middle Eastern format on
of taking forever?
on yes, exactly. Take it forever. But hopefully, I really do hope that this opens up some pathways and ideas for those of you that are interested in this to sort of really dig into the history here, because the history governs everything when it comes to European foreign policy and security, right? Like they don't have entrepreneurial to make it up on as they go along processes. I mean, the French sometimes do, the UK do, obviously Turks do because they have because of their independence, but the rest of the states don't. And so hopefully this helps you gain some of that
Insight.
that understanding.
Oh, we have a thank you.
Okay, thanks,
So-
Chris. I see Chris on a few other things too, so it's great.
yeah, thank you, Chris, for all of your questions. I mean, everybody who asked, but a lot of the questions came from you, and it makes it a lot more lively when we get questions. So we love questions, and we love talking about these topics more in depth. So please do ask them if you have them.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, and everyone enjoy the rest of your Sunday wherever you are in the world, and look forward to seeing you on one of the many events that Richard and Zach and others and Robert have put on, which are a pleasure to work with and be a party of.
Speaking about Robert, the stuff in New York City is starting this Thursday and will continue until the following Sunday. That's Sunday in 7 days. So he has a number of different activities for those of you who are based in New York or who will find themselves in New York during that time. I will be at some of those activities, and I believe Zach will be at some of those activities, and of course Robert will be at all of them. So we look forward to seeing you in the flesh.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Yep. Bye-bye.